the city of Le Havre on the Normandy coast of France. In the mid-19th century, this old seaport was the childhood home of one of the greatest artists of all time, Claude Monet. In his long working life, Monet was an innovator with a radical new approach to painting, an approach that would become known as impressionism. Well into middle age, his unswerving commitment to this new approach resulted in a life of poverty. But by the end of his life, Monet had become wealthy, a celebrated figure whose works were recognized as true masterpieces. Today, Monet's paintings sell for millions, reflecting his status as an artistic genius and the greatest of the impressionists. Oscar-Claude Monet was born in Paris on the 14th of November 1840. But at the age of 5, he came to Le Havre, where his father, Adolphe, worked successfully as a grocer and ship's chandler. Little is known of the boyhood of Monet. His school days were apparently unremarkable. But from his teenage years, his artistic leanings were already apparent. By the age of 15, he was a cartoonist and caricaturist. His drawings were sold in a local art shop for 20 francs each. Also on sale in this shop were the works of a local artist, Eugene Boudin. Unusually for the time, Boudin was an enthusiast for painting in the open air. When he persuaded the teenage Monet to paint out of doors alongside him, the younger man was fired with a passion for open-air work. It was a passion that would never leave him.
Monet later said it was almost like the lids were taken off his eyes and he could see what painting could become. And so almost from the very beginning, when he started life as a painter, it was as an outdoor painter, as a plein air painter at the time. And so this instilled in him a lifelong belief in outdoor painting.
Monet decided to paint outdoors because he wanted to get an immediacy about his work which you could only get if you painted it in front of the subject. He was also very interested in light, as seen outdoors, natural light. That was his main preoccupation for most of his life.
One of the important things about Monet is to appreciate that he was almost single-mindedly pursuing one aspect of this pursuit of realism. In his attempt to do that, he felt increasingly that the object that was in front of him, be it a tree or a figure or whatever it was, or a facade, was something which needed to be captured. Transferring an impression that you might do as a sketch and then going to the studio and trying to put it down, you're removed from the actual sensation. So you needed to get nearer to the sensation.
In later life, Monet recalled the significance of his outdoor work with Boudin. Suddenly, a veil was torn away. My destiny as a painter opened up to me. Still a teenager, he announced to his family his intention to become an artist. In May 1859, he journeyed to Paris, the center of French cultural life. The young Monet soaked up the bohemian life of the city. He visited the great annual art exhibition at the Salon. He frequented the bars and cafes popular with the artistic community, and he worked at the Swiss Academy, a famous studio open to any artist for a small cash sum. Here, he also met Camille Pissarro, a painter who would later become a key figure in the impressionist movement. However, Monet's first stay in Paris was not especially productive. By his own admission, he wasted a lot of time with a lifestyle that bordered on the feckless. Perhaps because of this, when he was chosen for military service in 1861, his father refused to buy him out of his responsibility. Claude joined the cavalry and served in the North African colony of Algeria before contracting typhoid. Sent home to convalesce, his aunt, Sophie Lecadre, paid 3,000 francs to bring his military service to an end. As the only member of Monet's family to truly support his artistic ambitions, it was a fine gesture, and her nephew took advantage of it. Having promised a more serious approach to his work, in November 1862, Monet returned to Paris. The start of his second Parisian experience is now the stuff of artistic legend. he joined the studio of Charles Gleyre, a leading painter in the academic tradition of French art. This tradition emphasized art produced in the studio, with subject matter restricted to the historical or mythological, and a physical painting technique inherited from the old masters. When Monet arrived at Gleyre's studio, this tradition was totally dominant in France. The young man was quickly introduced to its strictures when Gleyre condemned him for painting a male model in a natural, lifelike manner. "Nature is all very well as an element of study," said the master, "but it offers no interest. Style, you see, is everything." The 22-year-old Monet already disagreed strongly with Gleyre's opinions, but his time at Gleyre's studio was nevertheless productive. His fellow artists there included Frederic Bazille and two future impressionists, Alfred Sisley and Auguste Renoir. In 1863, these young artists began to paint together at the Forest of Fontainebleau outside Paris. It was a significant venue. Here, the great Camille Corot and the Barbizon school of painters had sought to push back the boundaries of the academic tradition. Painting in the open air, their landscapes are more natural and their subject matter more mundane than a typical salon painting of the time. In the mid-1860s, Monet continued his artistic development in the Fontainebleau forest, with landscapes such as the Road from Chailly. Works such as these were not yet revolutionary, but Monet was already sure of his abilities to the point of arrogance. Though not yet established as a painter, he affected a lordly, aristocratic air. This was in spite of the fact that he was often in dire poverty, begging Bazille and the others for money and painting materials. His strong belief in himself was amply demonstrated in 1866, when he began his first major piece of work, Les Déjeuners sur l'herbe. This was to be Monet's version of the famous painting by Edouard Manet, which had outraged Paris society 3 years before with its bold brushwork and depiction of nudity in the shockingly contemporary setting of a Parisian park. Monet sought to trump the older man's achievements with a canvas 4 times as large. He hoped that it would prove triumphant at the 1866 Salon, the annual official exhibition which remained the only route to success for any aspiring artist. It was an ambitious project which turned out to be too ambitious. Monet lost valuable time when he was bedridden with an injured leg. When he eventually recovered, he completed several sketches and a final oil study before starting work on the final painting. But he soon realized he would be unable to complete his huge task in time for the Salon, and so he simply abandoned it. Only 2 large fragments of the work survive. How the Salon would have reacted to the complete image will never be known.
For Monet, it was almost the title that he took and very little else. It was a sense of a restatement of an idea, but in contemporary clothes and in a much more everyday environment rather than something which perhaps had an artistic overtones to it, which the Manet painting had.
Monet's Déjeuner is an attempt to set the figures naturalistically in an outdoor background. Manet's painting is much more artificial. Monet gives much more emphasis to the trees, to the landscape. They take up, in fact, about half the top part of the painting. And his figures below the trees, having their picnic, have dappled sunlight shining on them.
Unperturbed, Monet decided to present a more conventional portrait to the 1866 Salon, The Woman in a Green Dress, a painting which indicates a change in Monet's personal life at the time. The model for the portrait is Camille Dancière, Monet's girlfriend, a young woman who also posed for all the female figures in Les Déjeuners sur l'herbe. The Woman in a Green Dress proved popular at the Salon, and Monet quickly forgot his problems with Les Déjeuners and proceeded to his next Salon entry, Women in the Garden. For the first time, Monet decided to execute a large painting entirely in the open air. To do this, he dug a trench so that the 8-foot-high canvas could be moved up and down by means of a pulley system. The result was Women in the Garden, in which the female figures are, again, modelled by his companion. It remains a fine work, with striking colour contrasts between the women's dresses and the grass of the garden lawn. However, the Women in the Garden is possibly more significant for its means of execution than the finished painting. It is said that the French realist artist Courbet visited Monet as he painted the canvas and found him sitting apparently idle before it. He soon realized that Monet was simply waiting. Before painting the leaves onto the trees, he wanted the light to be exactly right. This concern with the transitory nature of light would come to be a massive feature of Monet's future work.
The light in the painting had to be consistent across the whole canvas. And Courbet couldn't understand that for Monet, the whole painting had to be produced within the same light scheme, so that as the light dictated the way how the figures were painted, so it would dictate how the trees, the grass and everything else in the painting was painted. And then the whole thing would become a unified picture.
Monet was became a very single-minded pursuit of what the eye saw, not what the intellect told the eye to see. Was tied up with a lot of other artists who were also interested in the whole business of optics and of vision. And a number of very eminent scientists were working at theories of colour, theories of vision and so on.
Monet and Pissarro were both interested in Chevreul's colour theories. So after the late 60s, for several years in fact, they limited their palette more or less to the 3 primary colours and their complementaries.
Initially, he was relying, I think, very heavily upon what Manet was doing. The flat areas of colour, in other words, light as floodlighting from the front, cutting out lots of gradations. So you've got brightly lit areas, bright areas of colour, almost cardboard cutout, one against the other. That early work in the garden, it's clearly that the figures there are seen in full light against what is much more, as we can see now, an impressionist technique relating to the trees and the grass and so on. That's a way that he was beginning to explore.
Unfortunately, his innovations were lost on the juries of the 1867 Salon. They rejected the work, which was a genuine blow for the artist. The late 1860s were a time of grinding poverty for Monet. In 1867, still unmarried, he was presented with a son by Camille, which only increased his financial burden. Moving on regularly, in 1869, the Monet family found themselves at Bougival, near Paris, while Renoir lived with his parents at nearby Louveciennes. Claude and Camille were so poor that Renoir resorted to stealing bread from his mother to feed his fellow artist. The history of art can be grateful for his ingenuity. That summer at Bougival, on the waters of La Grenouille, Monet and Renoir painted together, and a revolution was born. The work produced by the two friends at La Grenouille in 1869 was remarkable, with Monet's painting the more daring of the two. In a canvas like Bathers at La Grenouille, the artist used vigorous and fragmented brushstrokes that allow no scope for close-up detail. The bathers in the water are just blobs of paint. What is captured on the canvas is a fleeting impression of the scene, just as in real life, an individual is unable to comprehend all the detail within the visual field. Paintings like this, and the canvas simply entitled La Grenouille, also demonstrate a new approach to colour. Both Monet and Renoir began to use unmixed colours, with a strong emphasis on the primary colours and their complementaries. Drawing from the colour theories of the chemist Eugène Chevreul, the two artists discovered that the effect of colour is not unchanging, but is affected by the colours surrounding it. This discovery profoundly changed the painting of shadows. Previously, they were painted brown or black. Monet and Renoir now began to colour them according to the colours around them. These discoveries resulted in paintings unlike anything ever seen before.
Monet, through working with Pissarro, in fact, found that shadows were not black. He dispensed with black from his palette in the 60s. His shadows not only were not black, but they reflected the complementary colours of the colour he was using for shadows. So if he had a blue shadow, he'd have a little dots of orange in as well. He saw that shadows reflected what was around them, just as ordinary objects did.
When Monet began to look at light, particularly because he was painting everything out of doors, he simply looked at the colour, irrespective of whether it was shadow, highlight, whatever, and then put that colour down on the canvas. We begin to see how the shadow colour is as brilliant and as varied and has as much intensity of colour as highlights. And this completely revolutionised how people saw colour. Because he was able to perceive it more clearly, it became much more radical on the paintings.
Shadow had tended to be the opposite of light, negation of light. In other words, it was dark, very often variations on black. Monet realised that, in fact, it's much more complicated than that. It is the loss of light from a particular direction because of an object getting in the way, but it is also takes onto itself reflected light from its surroundings. So it becomes, each shadow therefore becomes very different in the individual.
But works like these did nothing to ease Monet's financial predicament at the time. He made another attempt at salon success in 1870 with The Luncheon, a painting far more conservative than his work at Bougival. Its rejection made Monet give up the whole idea of painting for the salon. That summer, he returned to his own approach.
Monet met Renoir when the two were actually at a studio, Glaer's studio in Paris. They probably wanted to do large-scale paintings, but simple financial restraints meant that they couldn't do that, and so that they reverted rather to producing smaller paintings, which were in fact the first beginnings of what Impressionism was all about. They began to see a virtue more in the idea of working more fully on what were originally sketches and then exhibiting them as finished paintings. It rather cut them off from the idea of sending works to the salon. The salon rather demanded large-scale finished paintings. But at the same time, it opened them up to a different clientele, people who could not afford huge paintings 10, 12 feet high.
Still poverty-stricken, he married Camille on June the 28th. That summer, the couple honeymooned at Trouville on the Normandy coast. There, Monet painted a series of small beach scenes, painted quickly and entirely in the open, proved, if proof were needed, by the grains of sand blown into the paint of his canvas, the beach at Trouville. Here, his bold approach to brushwork can again be witnessed, notably in the dress of the woman on the left, the new Madame Monet. Of course, the viewer could not know the identity of either woman directly from this image. Again, it is the impression that counts. During this summer, Monet was joined by Eugène Boudin. The contrast between Monet's beach scenes and creations of his old mentor are striking. Monet's was literally a new art. As Monet painted his wife on the beach, however, politics were about to intervene in his life. In July, the Franco-Prussian War broke out. As an opponent of the French emperor, he decided not to fight. Leaving his wife and child with Boudin, he fled to London. It was an important experience for him. As well as painting there, he also experienced the work of Constable and Turner. He also met up with Pissarro, who had also fled the war, unlike Basile, who chose to fight and was killed as a result. Most significantly in London, Monet met the art dealer Paul Duras-Ruel, a man whose support for Monet and the Impressionists would prove to be massively important. Duras-Ruel's purchasing power made itself felt as soon as Monet returned to France, following the end of the war in 1871. By buying many of Monet's works, the dealer enabled the artist and his family to set up home in Argentuil, a riverbank suburb of Paris. It was a town best known as a boating resort. Its regattas attracted international competition. Boats and river scenes would provide much of Monet's inspiration over the next 7 years. In 1872, he painted Boats Regatta at Argentuil, a small work notable for the reflections on the surface of the water, executed quickly in unblended, self-contained colour. In paintings like this and The Red Boats of 1875, Monet's skill with colour is apparent. By contrasting complementary colours like red with green, he accentuates the effect of both.
The interesting thing about Monet is that his treatment of water was different from everybody else's. Before Monet, people tended to think of water to be treated one way, skies to be treated another way, trees to be treated another way. For Monet, it was all the same, so that the context in which he saw the water defined the colour that he saw within it. And when he could understand how the colour worked, he would put that down. Every single painting of water that he did was a completely new, different painting. And yet, the sense that we get of water within his paintings is much more powerful than in any paintings that had ever been done before.
His desire to paint the life of the river led Monet to construct a floating studio, which he would moor before sitting down to effect his open-air paintings. A famous painting of Monet at work on this floating workplace was made by Edouard Manet in 1874, a work which shows the older artist experimenting with some of Monet's innovations. Monet was not short of company during his Argentuil days. Sisley and Renoir were regular visitors, painting and discussing the new artistic thinking that now permeated their work. In 1873, these artists began to consider a bold new idea: to put together an independent exhibition of their paintings. In December 1873, the so-called Société Anonyme was formed by 11 artists, including Monet, Renoir, Sisley, Pissarro, and Edgar Degas. Their intention was to show their work together at just such an exhibition. On the 15th of April the following year, at the studios of Nadar, a Paris photographer, their work was revealed to the public for the first time.
It was against the normal canon of academic work, and here were artists who were not going for detail. They were slapping colour with no attention to outline or to perspective or anything else. It was just regarded as bad painting.
Monet's Impression Sunrise was considered not revolutionary so much as inept. Viewers were surprised that he could exhibit something so apparently unfinished. In the Boulevard des Capucines, he was criticised because the people did not look like people. They looked like, and indeed they were, little dots of stripes of colour. And this was felt somehow derogatory to the human race.
Monet exhibited 12 works at the 1874 exhibition, and, like the works of his fellow artists, they were subjected to critical abuse. Many considered absurd the lack of detail in works like Monet's Impression Sunrise. The critic, Louis Leroy, said that wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape. Taking his cue from the title of the work, Leroy mocked the whole show as an exhibition of the impressionists. Unintentionally, he gave the new artistic school its name. In subsequent exhibitions, the new breed of painters would describe themselves using the supposedly derogatory term, and by the time of the 8th and final exhibition in 1886, the term impressionism was long established. Monet failed to exhibit in that final exhibition, but he showed work in 5 of the previous 7. At the second show in 1876, he displayed the Japanese Girl, with his wife once more the model. A strange, untypical work. Monet perhaps imagined that the contemporary vogue for Japanese prints would boost its commercial prospects. If so, he was right. It sold for 2,000 francs. At the third show in 1877, however, Monet displayed a far more significant collection of work. A total of 30 canvases, including 7 remarkable paintings of the same Paris railway station, the Gare Saint-Lazare. The Gare Saint-Lazare was the Paris terminus for the railway service that ran through Argentuil. In January 1877, Monet began to paint the glass-roof station with its steam-billowing locomotives. He was once again living in poverty at the time. Despite some sales of his work, such as The Japanese Girl, a recession affected France in the second half of the 1870s. Significantly, this economic downturn also affected Paul Duras-Ruel's ability to buy Monet's work. Famously, though, Monet failed to let his poverty show. At the Gare Saint-Lazare, he acted with the airs and graces of a wealthy man, persuading the railway authorities to stop trains and clear platforms to suit the apparently famous artist. The results of Monet's subterfuges were a series of images defiantly impressionist in their execution.
Monet was fascinated by railways, and in the 1870s he moved back into Paris so he could paint at the Gare Saint-Lazare. He was mainly interested in the effects of the steam, I suppose it was as well, because he'd been criticised for painting too much fog in London. So he thought he would really do an investigation of such phenomena. And what he found out was that the steam dissolved certain shapes because of the light that reflected from it. And in the building behind the station, you can see this particularly well. In fact, you have to look quite closely on some of the paintings to see that it is a building at all. It's patches of sunlight and then the colour of the brick, and then there's steam, of course, obscuring part of it as well.
Monet was always fascinated by the effects of fog, both artificial, as in the Gare Saint-Lazare series, and natural. During his time in London, he painted The Thames Below Westminster, which captures the impression of the fog for which the British capital was so notorious. In 1879, he painted an image of the village of Vertu, a village of the Seine immersed in a cold yet understated atmosphere of fog. Any sense of gloom present in this painting could hardly be considered surprising. At the time it was painted, Monet was still grieving. His wife, his beloved Camille, died in September 1879 at the age of just 32. having been ill since the pregnancy that resulted in Monet's second son, Michel. By the time of Camille's death, Monet's personal life had changed. In 1876, he had become acquainted with a wealthy Parisian couple, Ernest and Alice Hochschild. Ernest had helped financially with the third Impressionist exhibition, but shortly afterwards he became bankrupt and all but abandoned his wife and 5 children, who decided to move in with the Monet family at Vertu. After Camille's death, Monet and Alice would become partners and eventually husband and wife. The death of Camille also marked the low point of Monet's financial affairs. The early 1880s saw a recovery in the French economy and the personal wealth of Paul Durand-Royal. In 1881, he signed a contract to buy Monet's work that would generate 30,000 francs for the artist each year. In addition, the art world was changing. Though many were still critical of the Impressionists, the value of their work now began to be recognized. The power of the salon also began to weaken as Durand-Royal and others pioneered exhibitions of works by a single artist. In 1883, Monet and his 2 children moved to Giverny, a village on the Seine 50 miles from Paris. They moved into a house called La Pressoir, the cider press, with Madame Hochschild and her 5 children. He would live there for the remainder of his life. The unconventional nature of the household caused some concern in the conservative, rural community, but Monet, for one, was concerned more with his art. Now over 40, he was, at last, reasonably comfortable and settled, even if his habit of pleading poverty took some time to shake off. The 1880s would be the decade when Monet began to fulfill his artistic vision. His output was now prolific. At Giverny, he once again used a floating studio to paint river scenes. He also executed a group of works depicting figures in landscapes. The Woman with a Parasol. In this 1886 canvas is Suzanne Hochschild, the daughter of Monet's mistress Alice, although Monet has reduced her facial features to virtually nothing. Monet's skill is, instead, expressed with light and colour. The grass is a bold contrast between light and shade, executed with choppy brushstrokes that produce a sense of life and movement. The sky is altogether softer, while the subtle colouring of the woman's dress effectively brings together the whole composition, one of Monet's most delicate works at Giverny. Despite his love for his new surroundings, Monet continued to venture further afield in search of subject matter. The year 1886 was typical. He journeyed to Brittany, to the so-called wild coast at Belle-Île, a small rocky island exposed to the Atlantic Ocean. There he produced Storm, Rocks at Belle-Île, a dramatic seascape painted outdoors in the full force of the storm. Further evidence of Monet's passion for authenticity comes with his paintings of the arched Normandy cliffs at Étretat. 1886 saw him paint the cliff known as the Manneporte. To paint the subject from this angle, it was necessary for the artist to negotiate a treacherous cliff path. Although he had nearly drowned the year before, Monet returned in 1886 to produce a timeless image of nature. By now, he had adopted the practice of painting several canvases at the same time, each canvas representing the subject matter in a subtly different light.
Curiously, when we look at paintings like this, what we actually paint is not the object. It's the light between the object and ourselves. And it's a kind of ethereal mist that seems to imbue this space. And this is what Monet wanted to capture, what he wanted to put down on the canvas. But as the sun moves across, as the clouds move across the sky, whatever, it alters all of the colour scheme, all of the light, and so Monet took to an idea that if he was going to go outside and paint, he would have a contraption built with a number of canvases of the same size within it, like a kind of rack for canvases. And as the light altered from one canvas, he would put another canvas on. And as he built up each canvas, that canvas became a separate painting. It was of the same subject, but the painting was completely separate. It was a completely distinct image.
Commercially, things continued to improve for Monet. 1886 saw the first exhibition of his work in the United States. 1889 saw a major Paris exhibition featuring the work of Monet and the sculptor Rodin. By the turn of the 1890s, he was a leading figure in the world of art. But his success did not stop there. In 1891, he exhibited the first of his series paintings, works which perhaps represent the high watermark of Impressionism. The idea behind the series paintings was simple: to paint the same subject over and over again to show how changes in light affect the impression of the subject matter. Monet began with the Haystacks series and succeeded triumphantly. Painting in all weather conditions, Monet sought with each individual canvas to capture the instant, to paint the fleeting moment when, to use Monet's phrase, the scene is enveloped by a specific light effect. The Haystacks series was a huge success, both commercially and critically. Monet followed it with the Poplars, paintings of the tall trees that grew beside the river Epte, near to his home at Giverny. This was a project that nearly floundered. After he had begun work, Monet discovered that the trees were about to be cut down for timber. Luckily, he was able to strike a deal with the timber merchant to delay their felling until he had completed his work. By now, he could afford to. His wealth was increasing all the time. The Poplar series complete, he turned to the third and the greatest of his series paintings, the Rouen Cathedral series. In 1892 and 1893, Monet painted a total of 30 canvases depicting the stone facade of the great Gothic cathedral at Rouen. Working on up to 14 canvases at a time and painting the structure from just 3 separate positions, the resulting images can be seen as an illustration of time itself. Building up the image of the cathedral with thick layers of paint, Monet once again captured the enveloping effect of light at all times of the day and in all weather conditions. In the painting entitled Full Sunlight, the dramatic effects of the sunlight are captured both by the way it appears to dissolve the ancient stone and by contrast with the shadows within the arches of the portals. By considering the paintings as a series, the viewer is left in no doubt as to the link between atmospheric conditions and mood. To achieve this, with paintings of a structure made of lifeless stone, was nothing short of a triumph.
Monet started painting more than one canvas at a time, quite early on in his career, in fact. He developed it, of course, in the 70s and the 80s. The 80s especially with the Rouen Cathedral series. The end product of this is that we see the cathedral in the most amazing changes of mood. In some of them, when it's in full sunlight, the forms are almost completely dissolved by the white and yellow paint.
When 20 of the cathedral series were exhibited in 1895, Monet's status was secured. All of them were sold for 15,000 francs each, an astronomical sum. Aged 55, Monet was now a famous figure in France and beyond. His home life was also content. He married Alice Hochschild in 1892, having been able to buy his beloved Giverny home 2 years previously. Increasingly, his work was concentrated on Giverny, and he devoted more and more time to his garden. His wealth enabled him to hire 6 gardeners to help him create a floral wonderland. In addition, he obtained permission to divert the small river Roule, thus creating a lily pond. As Monet grew older, this garden provided the subject matter for some of his most intensely colourful paintings. However, Monet's travelling days were not yet over. In 1904, he and Alice visited Spain, driven by a chauffeur in an early automobile, while in 1908 and 1909 he visited Venice. However, his final significant artistic journeys had taken place some years previously, with his visits to London in 1899, 1900 and 1901. Living in the Savoy Hotel overlooking the Thames, he painted over 100 canvases depicting Waterloo Bridge, Charing Cross Bridge, and memorably, the Houses of Parliament. Here, the great Parliament buildings are little more than suggestive, just one component of an image where atmosphere, light, and colour represent the real subject matter. The final years of Monet's life were, however, devoted to his garden, and despite increasing problems with his eyesight, he continued to paint. The Japanese bridge that he built over the lily pond provides the subject matter for many of his later works. But it was the lily pond that provided the inspiration for Monet's final artistic triumph. As early as 1898, he conceived of a round room where the viewer would be surrounded by canvases depicting the lilies floating on an unbroken expanse of water. Many years passed without progress on this ambitious project, until the French Prime Minister, Clemenceau, promised Monet that France would provide a suitable setting if Monet completed the water lily project for France. Despite eye problems and his advancing years, Monet set about his final task. In 1926, it was eventually completed shortly before the great artist's death.
Monet decided that his paintings should go in a circular room. He wanted the viewer to be completely enveloped by his paintings, so it's absolutely integral to the overall effect.
What he wanted to do was create a painting which it was almost as if one was right in the middle of this water garden, that throughout the whole area, the whole effect would be as if one inhabited the whole space. So that the paintings were, in a sense, the first idea, the first expression of images that generated a space within themselves and were tailored to a particular room for where they would create the most powerful image on the eye of the spectator, the beholder.
In 1927, the giant canvas murals were installed in 2 oval rooms in the Orangerie in the Jardin des Tuileries in Paris, a place christened the Sistine Chapel of Impressionism. In this final great masterpiece, Monet created a continuous scene of tranquility. Of all Monet's works, these water lily decorations require, most of all, to be experienced physically. By experiencing them in their dedicated premises, the genius of a man well into his 80s can only be wondered at. It is a genius that continues to attract visitors in tens of thousands whenever his works are exhibited. The status of Claude Monet, the greatest impressionist, is secure forever.
his legacy was freeing up the artist from a naturalistic or realistic depiction of the real world. He would dissolve the world in light and colour. He moved the subject of painting completely away from storytelling or representational work, especially in his later work of the water lilies, which were practically abstract.
Since Monet's time, or from the mid-19th century onwards, I don't think it would be wrong to say that without Monet we would not have what we have today. In his pursuit, he released possibilities for other artists to take up. We can appreciate his own work, and this was certainly very, very different than that which was in the normal Royal Academy annual exhibitions or the annual salons in France. But just to stop at that, I think, would be wrong. And remember that photography fundamentally altered the perceived role of the artist, but also helped the artist. And it was Monet, I think, who came at a particular point and who released creative energies at a point at which it was necessary. If I had to put it on a broader context, it would say that we now see the end of the Renaissance, which laid the groundworks of what art was, how it should be viewed and how it should be produced. With Monet and those around him at the time, we see the start of the end. Although they did not see it that way, they still pursued realism within the context of the Renaissance. With the analytical cubist work of Picasso and Braque, and with the work of Kandinsky and Mondrian, we see the final breakdown and collapse of the Renaissance.
I think that Monet completely revolutionised how we see colour. A great deal of art was dependent upon what had gone before, and he swept all that away and said that an artist should use his own eyes, not see through someone else's. And with his own eyes, he created some of the most powerful, brilliant paintings that were ever painted.